your task for the next paper, okay? You're going to be writing a 2-page paper. Now, oh my gosh, 2 pages. Made you cram all that stuff into 1 page. Now we're going to go for 2 pages, living on the wild side, right? Is to summarize the article, which you already have a 1-page summary of. You have to summarize the article, focusing in on elements of the study's design that are relevant for discussing the validity, different types of validity. And in those 2 pages, you have to summarize probably about, it's going to be about maybe half a page, your summary. So now your summary's got to get cut in half, streamlined even more. And then you'll spend the rest of your 2 pages, or 2¼ pages, I think I said, something like that, talking about the 4 types of validity and how well the researchers maintained these different types of validity in their study. Now, it's not that the study has or doesn't have a type of validity. Every study that has variables has some construct validity. Every study that has statistics has some statistical validity. Every study has some degree of internal validity, some degree of external validity. The question is, how good is it? Right? You can have really strong internal validity, or you can have weak internal validity. You can have strong construct validity or weak construct validity. Think of validity as something that's happening on a continuum. And what you're trying to do is make a decision about where you think this study falls on the continuum for each type of validity. So in this paper, you're going to lead with that summary of the study, which you know well now. And then basically you're going to follow up with 5 more paragraphs. 4 of those paragraphs are going to focus on a different type of validity. So you're going to have 1 paragraph about construct validity, 1 paragraph about statistical validity, 1 paragraph about internal validity, 1 paragraph about external validity, and then you're going to have that final paragraph, which may just be a sentence or 2, which is your conclusion, pulling it all together. Right? And you've got 2 to 2¼ pages to do that. New Roman, 12-point font, 1-inch margins, right? So you don't have time to blather on about things that don't matter. The best way to write this paper and be concise and clear is to lead each one of those paragraphs with a clear topic sentence that makes a specific claim. So say you're talking about construct validity. You want to lead your construct validity paragraph with a topic sentence that makes a specific claim about how good the construct validity in Stansbury Munro 2013 was. You need to make a judgment call in that sentence. And you can't say, Stansbury Munro 2013 had construct validity. That's not a claim. Of course it had construct validity. It had variables. That's like saying, outside there is sky. Uh-huh. What? This is not informative. So you want to make a call. So let's think about construct validity. What is construct validity? What do we think about when we try to decide how good the construct validity of a study is? We've been talking about construct validity since like the first week class. What is it?
How well are the variables manipulated or measured?
Okay, it's about the variables, right? How well are they manipulated or measured? Let's unpack that a little bit, okay? Because certainly not all variables are manipulated, right? Mm-hmm. So let's think about validity is about how well the researchers designed and or chose their variables. Are the variables doing what they're supposed to do? Are they tapping into the distinctions they're supposed to tap into? Are they letting us clearly observe the behaviors that we're interested in? So let's think about the variables in this study. They have two independent variables, right? Because this is a factorial study. Right? So what is the first variable? Teaching method. Okay, good. Teaching method. Now they call it condition in the paper. It drives me nuts. Condition is not the name of a variable. No wonder students get confused. Condition is a level of a variable. So they need to clarify. So instructional condition or something like that would be better. And you are not restricted to the names they use in their paper when you write. You can describe what they did using clearer and better terms if it helps you make the distinctions you need to make. Okay? So, teaching method. Now, this had 3 levels, right? What were the 3 levels? Okay. So in that condition, all they did was teach with video game, right?
And lecture.
Oh, so there's something else here. So just calling it the video game condition isn't actually very clear, is it?
No.
Okay. So this is, they have a relevant lecture, right? Plus, like, video game activity. Yeah.
You, in your summary, defined the first IV, and you said there's 3 conditions. One's a relevant lecture plus video game, and then you defined it as A. Would you have to continually say the relevant lecture?
No.
You could just refer back to that?
You could do that. You could say, so one had this, and you could say it was a relevant lecture plus video game activity. And then you could say, in parentheses, the video game condition. And what you've done now is you've clarified for the reader what you mean. And that's important because remember, the reader of your paper hasn't read the original article. So it's up to you to be as clear as possible in as few words as possible. So relevant lecture and a video game activity. Okay, what's the next one?
Relevant lecture with real life examples.
Okay, relevant lecture plus, well, this is real examples too. So, how would we describe it? So what was their activity? So they didn't even do a video game activity, they kind of just did discussion of examples. Right? Something like that, maybe? Okay, what was the third condition?
Lecture on
Yeah, it's an irrelevant lecture, right? Because when we talk about relevant, what are we talking about? Relevant to the content of the test they take, right? So then they had an irrelevant lecture. This group had an irrelevant lecture plus discussion of examples. Okay, so let's think about this. What the researchers did was design an independent variable here that, if we look at the levels, we see that each level differs from another in just one way. So we're pulling apart different aspects of the learning experience through these variables. It's super common for students to learn using this technique, right? So this is the standard, that's a standard treatment control, right? This is a standard treatment control. Standard treatment control. And this is the experimental condition. Here's where they're doing the innovative thing. And down here, what kind of control is this, do you think? It's almost like a placebo control, right? It's like they think they're getting something relevant and they take a test that's not really relevant, or no treatment control, that's also fine. I could live with either one of those. Okay, why am I talking about all this stuff? Okay, so here we're thinking about how well they created their variable. Does their variable really help us distinguish relevant stuff that they're interested in? So here you've got relevant lecture and a video game activity. Another way to think about this is very active learning. Relevant lecture and discussion of examples. This is passive learning. And irrelevant lecture and discussion of examples is also passive. So there's a lot of stuff up there. Here you thought it was just an IV with some levels, but when you're talking about how well they designed their variable, it's important that you think about all these dimensions of what they did. So the experimental group differs from the standard treatment control in only one way, and that is the type of activity the students engaged in to learn about the material. In the experimental group, they engaged in an active learning activity where they designed an experiment and participated in it, did analysis, and that was how they applied what they had learned in that lecture. In the standard treatment control, they listened to this, that group heard the same lecture, but then instead of engaging in that active way with the material, they passively discussed it with the instructor, right, who showed them examples from other people's stuff, and maybe they brainstormed a little bit about how you might make an experiment, but it's still a much more passive application of the lecture content. Then in this no treatment control down here, they literally got no information relevant to the test that they were going to take at all. But it's still structurally similar. It's a lecture and discussion of examples, but what's changed now is the relevance of the content. So just another one dimension. So this variable is actually pretty smartly put together because each group is differing only in one way from the others. And that way, if I see a difference between the experimental group and the standard treatment control, I know what to attribute it to. Because they had the same lecture, so if I see differences between those two groups, what am I going to attribute it to? The difference in those two levels, which was the kind of application activity. That's very clean. That's very neat. If I see a difference between the standard treatment control and the no treatment control, I would hope I would. Jeez. Because the difference here is the relevance of the lecture. I can attribute how well they do to, if this group does better than this group, if the standard treatment control does better on the test than the no treatment control, I can say it's because they got content that was actually relevant to the topic of the test. That makes sense. So we've got those comparisons. Now, some people wonder about this no treatment control. Why is it even there? And part of it is to separate that out, but this is also kind of a check. Because one argument people could make about this experiment is that, well, maybe people just did better on the post-test because they'd seen the questions before. They took a pre-test, 2 days later they take a post-test. Maybe they just did better because they'd seen they'd seen the questions before. Test, retest, right? You're likely to do better if you take the same test again. And so this condition, quite smart, in that it demonstrates that people don't do any better if they've taken the same test. It doesn't do them any good just to take the same test over and over. They don't do better. So here you've got So this variable, while it seems pretty superficial if you just say, okay, so here's the video game condition, the lecture condition, and the no content. I don't understand calling it no content, because it's not that the class had no content. That's very misleading. They have to explain it, and it's not clear. But if you explain it, you're okay. But you can, what I've given you up here are different ways to talk about these levels. You can talk about the experimental condition, the standard treatment control condition, and the no treatment control, instead of always saying the no content condition or the irrelevant lecture condition or whatever. You need different words so that your writing doesn't get boring. Okay? You can also talk about the active learning condition versus the passive learning condition. Right? So you've got different ways to talk about the comparisons that you're making that may be helpful. So construct validity is about how well the researchers design their variables to tap into the phenomena they're interested in. This is the kind of thinking you want to do. How well is that set up? Is it really tapping into the thing that they're interested in? They want to know if engaging in an active learning activity will help students learn about the complex concepts related to factorial design. Does this variable do that well? What do you think? Well, you have to decide by Monday. Okay? You have to make a claim. So that topic sentence for the construct validity paragraph, you have to make a decision. You have to say Stansbury Munro 2013, or the design of the variables used in Stansbury Munro 2013 reflect good construct validity, or the study has strong construct validity, or the study has weak construct validity. Whatever your topic sentence needs to. Make a claim, throw down, and then the rest of the paragraph is backing it up. Now, you don't have 3 pages to back that up. You don't have time to write tons and tons of stuff. So what you're going to do is pick a piece of evidence that is very relevant to the claim you have made. And if you're going to argue for strong construct validity in this study, then you want to talk about their variables and how well designed they were. Or how great their dependent variable was for measuring what they were interested in measuring. And you want to be clear, it's an example. You can say, Stansbury Munro 2013 had very good construct validity. For example, consider their independent variable teaching method. And then you break it down for the reader and explain why this is a great variable for studying what they were interested in studying. And then you shut up and move on to the next topic, because you've got maybe a quarter to a third of a page to talk about this. 3 or 4 sentences, and then move on. Okay? We are not dwelling forever on everything construct validity. We are making a claim, we're backing it up with some evidence and some argumentation, and then we are moving on to the next case we want to make. Okay? So if you think, this is the kind of thinking you want to do about those variables. So let's think about their other IV. Their other IV was what? What's their other IV? Time. Okay. So how well did their time of what? Is time enough? Is that very descriptive? Does that help you? Time of test administration, I think, is more helpful in describing what they actually did. Okay, so their variable was time of test administration. What were the levels of that variable? Before what?
Any stimuli,
before treatment and after treatment, right? Before lecture and after lecture, right? Something like that. So, did they do a good job if they're trying to find out what people knew before and after they attended a lecture? Does that seem like a reasonable way to do it? Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, that variable is not nearly as interesting as this other one. So yeah, you could pull up IV of time of test administration and use that as your example, but it's not probably the strongest choice. What about their dependent variable? What did they use to measure? What were they measuring, and what did they use to measure it?
Measuring content knowledge.
Content knowledge of what?
Factorial
Yeah, knowledge of factorial designs, right? So they're the knowledge of factorial designs. And what did they use to do this?
14 questions, text from the book they were using.
Okay, so they use a multiple choice quiz made up of questions taken from the test bank associated with the book students were assigned to read. Does that seem like a reasonable way to tap into whether or not students learn the knowledge?
Yeah.
Questions connected to the textbook that they were assigned to read, probably also connected to the lecture that, yeah, I mean, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. So if you wanted to argue that they had a great dependent variable, you might be able to make that case. You're not going to have room to talk about all three of those variables. And whatever you do, don't talk about Dance Dance Revolution. You don't need to talk about Dance Dance Revolution or the Dance Dance Revolution experiments at all. You do not, you can just say they played a video game. Because what video game they played doesn't really matter at this point. It just matters that they engaged in active learning activity that involved using a video game to gather data in a factorial design. That's what's important. It doesn't matter that it's Dance Dance Revolution or that Dance Dance Revolution is produced by Konami or any of those things. And don't you pick as a good dependent variable students' scores on the Dance Dance Revolution game, because that's not the dependent variable for the experiment we're interested in. Okay, so make sure you focus on the right variables when you write that section.
You're talking about the critique, right? Don't mention DDR on the critique.
You don't need to, yeah.
What about summaries?
The summary's fine. You got more time, you got more space. But don't go off on it forever. You're gonna, I mean, even in the summary, it's probably not that relevant. And you don't have very much space. So if what really matters is that they engaged in an active learning activity involving using video games or applying what they had learned in the lecture to designing and implementing an experiment using video games, then that's what's important. It's not that it was Dance Dance Revolution or something else. Now, down the road, I can certainly see when we talk about one of these other types of validity, like say external validity. Let's pick external validity. When it comes to external validity, I could see that the fact that it was Dance Dance Revolution might be relevant. First, tell me what's external validity?
It's about the generalization.
Generalization, okay. What's that mean?
Does it relate to your population?
Okay, does it generalize to the population? Okay, so who is the population that they are generalizing to?
Undergraduate students.
Undergraduate students, all of them?
Psychology.
Psychology undergraduate students? Okay.
And research methods courses.
Psychology undergraduates who, well, they would argue, I think, that all psychology undergraduates have to take some research methods and statistics, right? That's their whole point, is that, you know, weird old professors like us think that this stuff is important, so we're going to make you do it. And you guys are like, why? And we're like, 'cause. And you're like, why? And we're like, let's play a video game. And you're like, okay. Right? So that's basically, that's the whole thing. That's what's going on here, right? Okay, so they're trying to generalize. They want to generalize to psychology students, right? This is an article published in the Teaching of Psychology. They're talking about psychology undergraduates. So if that's what external validity is about, then you have to think about to what extent does their design and the profile of their participants, things like that, to what extent would this generalize effectively to other situations, other groups, other games, whatever. Okay, you have to think about that. So maybe you want to come down. I've had students say, Stansbury Munro has terrible external validity. Okay, first of all, terrible is a little bit emotional. Okay, let's stick with things like weak or strong or moderate, not horrific, criminal. Stansbury and Munro were criminal in their design. No, they weren't criminal. There was nothing criminal about this. Okay. You're not trying to start a war. You're just trying to talk to me about validity. Okay, so we're not trying to incite people to violence over this paper. We're just talking about this. Okay, so keep it calm. So they're talking about undergraduates in psychology courses. And this has bad external validity because this study took place at a private college and the students were probably all white. And so it doesn't generalize to other racial and ethnic groups, so it has terrible external validity. Okay, let's back up a second. First of all, do we know anything about the racial and ethnic profile of the students in this study? No, we don't. So that's not probably the strongest point for you to attack the external validity of this study when we have no data. Now, if you wanted to, you could go hop on the website for the university and for the school where the authors are from, and you might get an idea. I think they're from Towson University. Is that right? I think that's right. They're from Towson. And if you go look, Towson is about 85% white. And it's a private school. Okay? So then you're like, well, it's not going to apply to other, unless you're rich and white, this won't work for you. I would say, really? So if you say it has terrible external validity because the students were probably white and attending a private school, what you're arguing is that for some reason, people who don't attend private schools or who aren't white won't learn by actively engaging with material. Is that a claim you want to make?
No.
I don't think so. I think that, now, that's probably not a place you want to land. But you might argue, I have heard a case that I thought was kind of reasonable about external validity, which was that this study wouldn't generalize well to undergraduate populations with a high proportion of non-traditional students. Non-traditional students might be less able-bodied and not able to engage in a game like Dance Dance Revolution. Now that's a case you might be able to make, although what proportion of non-traditional students we have, that tends to be pretty small, right? But this might not generalize well to an undergraduate population where or to undergraduate students who were much older or who had physical disability that prevented them from engaging in the same way with the game. If you're in a wheelchair, what do you do with Dance Dance Revolution? Watch. That's not very active, right? So they might have a problem generalizing that way. What if you have a hearing problem? Or a vision problem? Okay? So it wouldn't generalize well to undergraduate students who had a physical disability or physical limitations that prevented them from engaging with a game like this. Now then you have to think, okay, what proportion of students are likely to fall into that category? And if you think that that could be a substantial or meaningful portion of the population that they're trying to generalize to, then you can take them to task for it. Another case I've heard people make about the external validity of the study, if they wanted to challenge the study and say that it had weak external validity or only moderate external validity, was that this is a private college in the Northeast. And as such, the students who attend this college are likely to have come from higher socioeconomic groups and attended other private schools before they got there, right? You have to imagine if you're going to go to a small private college in the Northeast, you might have gone to a private high school or, been in private school your whole life. Private schools tend to have smaller class sizes, more resources, and teachers that are able to use more innovative and creative methods for teaching than public schools, where class sizes tend to be larger, teachers tend to have fewer resources, and it's much more about getting students through than crafting a learning experience. So it could be that the students in this study responded as well as they did to this technique because they were already familiar and comfortable with innovative classroom approaches. And students who had not grown up in going to schools where these type of innovative approaches were common might be very uncomfortable with this kind of technique and feel like it wasn't real learning. So that could be a problem. Now again, I'm not saying I necessarily agree or disagree with that claim. I'm just saying it's a claim and it's evidence and it's argumentation and it works. Okay? I don't have to agree with you. I don't have to think, yeah, that's how I would interpret that. But your evidence and your argumentation has to back up your claim that's in the topic sentence. And we could go for external validity. We could say it has great external validity, right? It's got a lot of flexibility, right? Students of all ages could enjoy playing a video game, okay, depending on the type of game you choose. And it wouldn't have to be a music or dance-based game. Why couldn't we play God of War, or Halo, or, I don't know, Elder Scrolls Online, something, World of Warcraft. Who knows? Maybe there's other video games that would be appropriate, that would be accommodating to people with different kinds of disabilities in a way that Dance Dance Revolution isn't. So the principle of using an active learning activity that involves video games to get students engaged with material is good, really good, and it would probably apply to other types of games, which means it has good external validity, right? Because it would generalize to other kinds of games too. The point is, you got to get up and do something, right? So you can make a case for external validity, coming and going, right? You can go weak, strong, moderate. You just need to pick the evidence and make the argument that is connected to your claim. What about statistical validity? What's that about?
It's about the pipeline or criteria.
I'm just going to have Abby's, you're exactly right. Abby's up here going, it's about this. Come on, people. You need to know this by Monday, by the way, so you don't. All right. So it's about type 1 and type 2 error. It's about the extent to which the readers believe that the statistics represent real results and not error. So to what extent do I believe that the statistically significant findings Stansbury and Munro got are real and not type 1 error? And the cases where they found no difference are real and don't reflect type 2 error. So let's think about what's the most important set of findings, statistical findings, for them. What mattered the most?
That those who had the lecture and the video game activity saw improvements in their the knowledge they gained on editorial design.
That the students, it's this thing, right? This is the big deal. What's the statistic related? What's the statistic that's about? Tell me again.
That those who experienced the lecture with the video game, they had the most increase in the knowledge from the of factorial designs that they benefited the most.
Okay, so they performed best on the test at the end compared to the students who had the students in the standard treatment control or the no treatment control. The students in the experimental group performed significantly better than students in the other two groups on the post-test of factorial knowledge. So that's about the interaction, right? The interaction of teaching method and time of test administration. Now, there are so really there's kind of two things on here that you might want to think about. Okay, first of all, so do you believe Can I get a hallelujah? Do you believe? Thank you. Do you believe? Sorry, my dad was a Baptist minister. I can go there if you want me to. So, do we believe that that statistically significant interaction represents something real and not type 1 error? How will we know that? Well, we have to trust they actually did, reasonable math and stuff. But the easiest way is, let's go in here and take a look. Oh my gosh, that section of Doom. Here's the cool part though now is you can look at that and you don't have to just skip over it. You actually know what the parts mean. You're like, oh, yeah, okay. There was a significant condition by time interaction. Okay. Now, and then it says figure 1. So there you go. You know exactly where you need to go. You can read it and everything. You even know what that means. All right. So they found a statistically significant interaction. Significant beyond 0.001. Okay, that's not maybe significant. That's not a little bit significant. That's significant all over the dang place. 0.001. We use 0.05. They're talking 0.001. That is a really tough criteria to fake. It's very strong. Okay. Now, tell me about this. What does an eta squared of 0.31 mean? Was it a little tiny effect, barely squeaking into significance?
That was largely significant.
Yes, 0.31 is a large treatment effect. That is a very large treatment effect. How big were theirs? How many subjects did they have in each condition? Oh, we have to go back here and look. How many did they have? Let's see. They had
25, 26.
They had 65 undergraduate students divided across 3 conditions, right? So at most, you're talking a condition had about 25 people in it. That's not giant. That's not a giant sample size. That's still a relatively small sample. Remember that we typically think of, like, if you want to be really confident that a sample will be normally distributed, you want to have an N of about 30. And none of these have 30 in them. And yet, they still got an eta squared of 0.31. That means that is a powerful interaction. It really matters. That combination of things, when they took the test and what their teaching condition, their learning condition was, really matters. Okay. That's not an on the edge thing. That's not a small treatment effect, barely hitting 0.05. That's a P of 0.001 and a large treatment effect. That combination together is compelling statistically. That makes me feel like I can trust that result. So that's what you want to be focusing on when you talk about statistical validity, is whether or not, in particular, do you think that their main statistical findings are real and don't reflect error. Now, I do have one concern. Here's my concern. So here we take a look. So we've got all these things. He said, sit down here, hold it. All right. So, let's see, however, this scares the crap out of me, by the way. However, the difference between pre-test and post-test for those in the lecture-only condition, right? That's the standard treatment control, right? Where they did lecture and then the passive discussion of examples with the professor. Okay. Only approached significance. Okay? So it was significant at 0.07, but we know that the minimum we will go with is 0.05, right? So it wasn't quite significant. So what does that mean? It means that students who learned in the standard way officially didn't learn. Okay? If we look at here up here on this graph, it's saying that this line right here, that's not enough slope to be significant. There wasn't enough change. It was close, but not quite. Now, that's the standard treatment. That makes me a little wigged out. Because if the standard treatment isn't showing improvement from pre-test to post-test, either all of college education is based on a false premise that lecture can be a medium for learning, lecture and passive discussion, and that's terrifying, or there's something wrong here. Something weird is going on here. And it's not necessarily like intentionally weird, it's just, it's concerning in statistical terms that they did not get even a basic statistical difference between pre-test and post-test for the standard treatment group. That's just weird. And I'm a little bit concerned about that finding, because it doesn't really make sense. How could all of college, I mean, think about it, that's, how many classes have you been to?
Countless.
Like that. Have you learned stuff?
I hope so.
We hope so.
I think it's pretty right.
Huh? Well, you might learn better other ways, but it doesn't mean you don't learn. And what those stats say is they didn't learn anything, because it's not significant. So it's equivalent to no difference. It's numerically different, but it's not big enough to count. So that finding says that the traditional method of teaching results in no learning. I just don't believe it. I don't believe, I mean, I guess I kind of have to. Maybe this is just my, blind attribution. I can't accept it because it makes my world want to crumble down around my ankles. But I actually believe that students can learn things from lecture and discussion without getting up and dancing to Lady Gaga. I believe it's possible. And so I'm a bit concerned, but here's the good thing. Their sample was a little bit small. So it's possible that with a slightly larger sample, this difference would roll over into statistical significance. Not superstar significance, like that one standout cell, but the samples were pretty small. The downside here, and this to me is a concern for statistical validity, is that if you look at the results section down there, they don't report the effect size for that comparison. So we don't know if it was a small, medium, or large effect. And if it were a small effect, then I would say it's not going to matter how big you make the sample, it's probably not going to manifest. But if it was a medium or a large effect, and it just was that the sample wasn't big enough, then what they've got going on here is type 2 error. They missed a difference because their sample wasn't big enough. It just wasn't as big a difference as the other one. But those are things you can talk about with statistical validity, right? To what extent do I believe that the statistically significant outcomes are true and not reflective of type 1 error? And to what extent do I believe that the statistically non-significant outcomes are true and not the result of type 2 error? And I think you could argue that you could take this either way. You could say it's strong and focus on that interaction result and talk about how powerful it was. You could say it's weak and focus on that weird control condition that got the weird result. You could say it was moderate and talk about both of them. But, something like that. But focus, go with a strength, right? Something that's going to clearly support whichever claim you make in the topic sentence. All right, so that leaves us with internal validity. What's internal validity about?
I just had a question about the statistical validity. Do we need to like define type 2 error
No.
or anything with it? Okay.
No, I think
So
I
just
think I said in the instructions, you can assume that the reader of the article is familiar with basic experimental terminology. So you don't have to explain what type 1 and type 2 error are, but you would have to make a case that you would have to make it clear in your description that you know what they are. You know, you like when you say, so, you know, it seems unlikely that it represents type 1 error because the effect is very robust, and so it seems very, you know, it has a large effect size even with a small sample, and that suggests that the finding is trustworthy. That makes it clear to me reading that sentence that you know what type 1 error is. It's a significant result you can trust, or not having type 1 error. So you don't have to define terms like that. You don't have to tell me what an experimental condition is, but you have to tell me what their experimental condition is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you use the term experimental condition, you need to use it correctly. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You don't have enough space. I only gave you 2 pages. You don't have time to define all these terms too. You have to craftily demonstrate that you know what they mean. Right? Make you earn this. 2 pages. People are like, yay, I love it, it's only 2 pages. Oh my gosh, how much stuff I have to put in 2 pages. Here's the good part about it. It's really, really hard to plagiarize anything under these circumstances because you have to cram so much information in and nobody else can get that into that little space, which is good. It makes it. Last semester, when we worked on these papers like this, was the first time I never had to submit anybody for plagiarism on the papers because they're just like, I don't even have time to plagiarize. Plus they said, I know this article so well, I don't even have to look at it anymore. Good, that's the idea. You shouldn't even be looking at it anymore, for the most part. You should know it. You should be able to write this for the most part. You might need to go check it for details, like, what was the exact effect size for that interaction? So I don't expect you to memorize that. But you shouldn't need to go back and look at this much, because you should know it, especially by the last paper. You should know it like the back of your hand. Okay, so internal validity. What's internal validity about?
How well it eliminates compounds.
That's right. How well the design eliminates compounds, okay, or alternate explanations for why the data pattern like it did. Okay, we want to believe that the whole point of an experimental design is to establish cause, right? We talked about that at the very beginning. Experiments are about establishing cause. And one of the fundamental requirements of doing that is making it clear that other explanations, other third variables, right, are not present that could explain the differences that we see. The only thing that can explain the differences we see in the data are the manipulations that the researchers have done. Now, let's think about those independent variables, shall we? Instructional conditions. So we talked about how nice and neat and clean that variable of teaching method or instructional condition was. How nicely set up. So now what you have to do is say, well, what they're arguing is that those students in the video game condition did super well because of the active learning activity. So my question to you is there any other way that those students were different from the students in the other conditions aside from the fact that they played a video game? Different teachers! Oh my God, are you serious? You're going to do a paper about teaching method and you confound teaching method and instructor? What were you smoking? Seriously. Teaching method. Even if you have 2 teachers with the exact same material to teach, are they going to teach it exactly the same way? No. So, okay, different teachers. So the person who taught in the experimental group was different than the person who taught in the standard treatment control group, right? Mm-hmm. And that person was different than the person who taught in the no treatment control group. Mm-hmm. So literally, they confounded their primary independent variable with
instructor. Oops. Because now we don't know if it was the activity or the instructor. Now, I mean, this is not uncommon in pedagogical studies being studies of teaching. It's not uncommon because most teachers don't teach 3 or 4 or 5 sections of the same class every semester. You might teach 1 or you might teach 2, not 5. This is a small private college or medium-sized private college. Class sizes are probably smaller. So to teach a certain number of students, you might have to teach 2 or 3 sections, and that might be the limit of what any one professor does in a given term. So there's maybe nothing they could do about that, but it's a problem for the internal validity of the study. Other things that threaten the internal validity of the study. Subjects were not randomly assigned to the conditions, because it would be unethical to do that. You can't randomly assign. I mean, just imagine how you would feel. Okay, you guys got to take 35-30. You know you have to pass it to graduate. You know you have to pass it to go through the major. And I'm going to randomly assign you to the professor. You don't get to pick the time. Doesn't matter what their ratemyprofessor.com hot pepper score is. None of that. We're just going to randomly assign you for science. How'd you feel about that?
Bloodthirsty.
Bloodthirsty. Really? How would you feel? Bloodthirsty. I mean, think about you. This is an important class, right? I'm sure that you thought about things like the time when the class met. But how many of you actually took into consideration who was teaching the class when you signed up? Did you read ratemyprofessor.com? Yes. You look, right? Because if it's a really hard class and you hear that it's really rigorous and complicated, you're going to talk to your friends and find out who they say they took and they liked. You're going to look online and see what people have said about that. See if it's a good fit, because that matters in a hard class. In an easy class, whatever. If a person maybe can't teach their way out of a wet paper bag, you don't care. But in a hard class, you want to have a professor that you feel like is going to be on your team and is going to help you out and is going to provide you with adequate support. Right? That's what you're hoping for. I don't know if that's what you're getting, but I'm trying. Okay? So that's what you hope for. Right? Now what if I just said, I don't care about any of that. I don't care about your fit. We're going to randomly assign you. Bloodthirsty. Right? This is your grade in this critical class that you're paying for, that you have to pass. Right? That's a problem. Well, you say, well, we won't do it for the whole class. We'll just do it for this unit. Well, that would be really weird. How often does that happen in the real world? Where, okay, we're randomly assigning you to a different teacher for this really hard unit. That's going to work great, because you haven't spent all semester learning about how your teacher tests and how your teacher teaches and stuff. Now we're just going to throw all that out the window. That doesn't make very much sense. So there are very good reasons why they didn't randomly assign. And there are very good reasons why instructor was confounded with instructional method. Very practical reasons. So they're not bad human beings or horrible scientists or any of those things. They're for very practical, real-world reasons. The researchers were unable to do random assignment and were in a situation where they ended up confounding instructor with instructional method. And what that means is we can't make any causal claims based on their findings. The internal validity is clearly threatened by that. Because we don't know. If the person who got the Dance Dance Revolution condition, I mean, you have to be a certain kind of professor to be able to pull that off, don't you think? Yeah.
Don't we need to recommend how to make it better or something?
Well, you certainly could recommend in your conclusion ways that the study could have been improved to improve its validity. So you can say it would have been much better if the same teacher had taught one section using this approach, or something like that. realistic or not is a completely different matter.
No, I never thought.
But then what's the other problem?
They would be tired.
They'd be tired, and then like by the time they get to the regular, okay, whatever, let's yeah. It could be very difficult for them to have enough energy, and it takes energy to teach this class. Someone suggested I should add to my tattoos by getting the Monster M tattooed on my arm, like a sponsorship. Get them to like increase my salary and like show off my Monster tattoo every day.
I'll give you free stuff.
They probably would. Give me free stuff. I don't want to. All right. So you don't. If you find something like that, where there is a pretty major compound. Remember, it also doesn't mean that the researchers are bad human beings, that they're terrible researchers, that they clearly weren't paying attention. Don't go down any of those extreme routes. They're not bad people or bad scientists. They were restricted by practical considerations. Now, did they do anything to help the internal validity? Well, they said that all of the instructors were all experienced and comparably good at teaching the class. So they tried to make them as similar as they could. But there are a number of experienced teachers for 3530, and you might work great with some of them and not great with others, right? So people can be good for different reasons. And those reasons may or may not mesh with what you need. But remember, always temper your challenges with objectivity. You can say the internal validity of the study was very weak, particularly because of a confound in one of the primary independent variables. And that may be the main course of the main focus of your paragraph. But it's completely worth saying, of course, the researchers were aware of this problem, or likely were aware of this problem, but were forced to make the choices they did because of practical considerations. You're recognizing that they're not horrible human beings. And they're not. It's just, this is a downside of this type of research. You have limitations about what you can do when you're talking about real world classroom studies. Because there's all these other factors you can't control. And that's what makes this quasi-experimental. Because there's so many things we can't control about what happens in a classroom, regardless of what we do up here or what you guys do up here. Because there's all these other things happening. So you can absolutely, in your paper, make a recommendation. If you think that they did something that wasn't so great, you could wrap up your paragraph on that topic or put in your conclusion how you think the study could be improved. But your conclusion should definitely come down with some general overall assessment of the study. So in general, Stansbury Munro 2013 was a good study. It was particularly strong in terms of this and this type of validity, but substantively weaker in terms of these two other types of validity. Future research in this area would benefit from more careful control of the instructional variable or whatever, and then stop talking. 2.25 pages max. You could be like, can I do 2.5? Only if you make it really worth my time. If it's 2.5 pages because you couldn't edit, no. Then I'll come after you. If it's 2.5 pages of critical thinking genius, written objectively and thoughtfully, right on. So you decide whether you want to put me through another 1/4 page of your writing or not. Before I decide what your grade is. Okay? Now, you're not going to get feedback from the revised summary paper you tuned in today before this paper is due. There's no way we can get them all scored it back to you. But you will get feedback on that summary paper before the revised version of the critique is due. So you'll be able to use feedback about things like APA style and proofreading and other stuff to improve that revised version. I encourage you, I have office hours all over the place right now. Come see me if you have questions. Crank out a draft in lab. 2 hours. Do it. Crank out a draft in lab. and then come to me and say, how am I doing? Because I can tell you, in a 15-minute office hour visit, if you printed out a copy of your paper, I can sit there and go flip, 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 flip. I've done it for lots of students, and I can tell you anything that jumps out at me as a problem. Remember, do not cite more than once per paragraph. Typically, the best place to cite is in your topic sentence. Okay? Does anybody have any questions? I know you're all packing up and ready to run. I know you have. Yes?
This is about this paper.
Oh.
Are we gonna get the, like, overview of the synthesis paper pages or whatever on Monday?
Yes. You will. And the synthesis paper, you ready? 3 pages to 3.5.
Oh, okay.
That's going to be 2 papers you got to talk about. Yes.
I always thought I hated writing like papers